numbers, from 0 to 9. Having the capacity or the ability to manipulate this number can either make one a genius or one will be rated as an imbecile. And the more one understands how to manipulate these numbers, the more one is able to understand the nature of things in the universe. And so they were all focused on the principle of numbers, and all the theories were centered on how to manipulate numbers. So they agree that the number is supreme. And secondly, they equally agree that the soul is immortal and indestructible. Now, these numbers, according to them, were 10 from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's 10 numbers. And they concluded by saying that each of these numbers represents a planet. And therefore, there are altogether 10 planets in the universe. Each of the numbers represents a planet. So there are 10 planets in the universe. So that was the position of the Pythagorean school. Now, if you look at the arguments of the Pythagoreans, of course, they were a very serious group that no one can ever dismiss, because later findings reveal that till date, you will agree with us that the number indeed is supreme, because there is nothing we can do about the universe without talking of numbers. The principle of numbers is essential, in the field of sciences, in mathematics, in whatever one does in life. You cannot do away with numbers. And secondly, the idea of the immortality of the soul, or the transmigration of the soul, were eventually taken over by some other religions which still exist today. The Orphic religion might have been dead by now. I cannot easily remember which people are still practicing Orphism, but the teachings or effects of Orphism were later found in some other religions. For instance, if you take Christianity and Islam, they believe that in the principle of the immortality of the soul. That's where the idea came from. The soul, they believe, does not die. And then you talk about transmigration of the soul. Other Eastern religions, such as Buddhism and Hinduism, believe that the soul transmigrates. In other words, by transmigration, we're talking about the soul, changing its form of existence. That is to say, when a person dies, only the body that decays, the soul does not die. Rather than dying, the soul only comes back. The soul goes to the maker or the owner, and then returns back in a lower form or in a higher form, depending on one's previous existence. If one had lived very well, a good life, the one is likely to come back in a better form or in a better body. So, if one did not live well, one can come back to life in a lower form to serve punishment for his previous existence. So the nature of the soul depends on its previous existence. And that is why for the Buddhists and the Hindus, it is wrong to kill any living object, because that object could represent the soul of a brother, or the soul of a relation, or the soul of anybody that one initially knows, who came back to serve a severe punishment for his previous existence. And so the idea of immortality and transmigration of the soul later got into some other religions as we have them today. Now, after Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, the third school of philosophy were the Eleatic school. The Eleatic school, led by Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Zeno. Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Zeno. This school of philosophy are still searching for the basic stuff of reality, the fundamental element that is responsible for all the things that exist in the universe, as started by members of the Ionian or Milesian school. However, in a different form. At this point, the Eleatics were particularly interested in, the difference or differences between change and permanence. The argument between Heraclitus and Parmenides of that era were based on the fact that for Heraclitus, everything changes. Change is the only constant thing in nature. And reality shows that everything changes. According to him, these changes were made possible by, the Logos. The Logos represents, what he calls an eternal light or eternal fire, which keeps burning in order to transform nature and to transform reality. This eternal light or eternal fire is one that is far superior than human intelligence, and so it is responsible for all the changes that we find in nature, because it makes it possible for the conflict of opposites. For everything that exists in its positive form, there is always something to negate it, and this negation is like a counter conflict, which makes it possible for constant opposition, as a result of which new ideas or new life comes to be. So for anything that exists, there is always something to negate it. So Heraclitus believed that the only constant thing in nature or in life is change. Change is the only reality which occurs constantly as a result of as a result of the fact that the Logos is responsible for transforming everything in the universe. Now, that position of Heraclitus did not go down well with Parmenides and his supporters. In fact, for Heraclitus, reality was about the Logos and changes. In fact, he upheld the fact that changes were necessary because that is the only thing that brings about transformation. Conflict is necessary if society must be transformed. Where there is conflict, you discover that new ideas, new ways of life, new things emerge. But without conflict of opposites, everything will remain stagnant. So there is always the need for this constant conflict in human affairs in order to bring about progress. So at this time, Heraclitus criticized those who call for an end to war. Remember, it was an era, 6th century BC was an era in which the Greeks were always in a constant conflict with their neighbors. Among them internally, they were always, one group was always at war with the other. So some people like some poets like what were they called now? Let me recall. Some poets like Hesiod. Hesiod had called for an end to war among the Greek city-states, and Heraclitus criticized that, saying that calling for an end to war is like calling for an end to human progress. That war is necessary for human progress. After all, in the event of war, ammunitions are created. So many new things are brought up. So it leads to the improvement of, man's technical know-how and so many other things. And so it is not always in the negative. That human knowledge also increases in the course of that, and changes and transformation are brought about. So he criticized those who call for an end to war. and insisted that conflict is a necessity, in human interactions. Now, that position did not go well with Parmenides and members of the group. Parmenides says that this Heraclitean conclusion was based on ignorance. Ignorance about the nature of reality. That Heraclitus did not understand the nature of reality. That reality is that nothing actually changes. That the idea of changes, as propagated by Heraclitus, was based on an illusion of the senses. It was based on an illusion of the senses. That in reality, the senses shows that reality changes, but in reality, nothing actually changes. Everything remains the same. Reality is in a state of permanence, and nothing actually changes. It is only our senses that deceives us and makes us believe that reality changes. It does not really change. Now, to prove himself right, Heraclitus, gave an example of an individual, for instance, who right from the mother's womb. Okay, he started by asking a question. Before we were conceived, before we were created, where were we? Before we were conceived in our mother's womb, where were we? And if you interrogate that properly, you find out that the answer is nothing. That is to say we were nowhere, or we do not know where we were, implying that we were nowhere. So Parmenides says we were nothing. Until the point of conception, we were nothing and we were nowhere. Even after conception, we discovered that the fetus began to grow in our mother's womb. And then after 9 months, the fetus was expelled as a baby. And the baby continued to grow from one stage to another, from baby to an infant, from infancy to adolescent, from adolescent to adult, from adult to old age. And after old age, assuming the person completes all the cycles of life, then the person retires into oblivion, turns back to where he came from. Now the question is, has anything changed? He says no, nothing has really changed. Reality remains the same. You were born human, you return back to where you came from as human. You came from nothing and onto nothing, you retire. Nothing absolutely has really changed. So, but those who lack the understanding of reality fear that something has changed, but reality remains the same. You came from nothing and onto nothing, you return to. So this idea about change and permanence was the basic argument that prevailed among the Eleatics, Heraclitus and Parmenides. Now, the Pythagoreans particularly, and so many other people of that era, criticized Parmenides for arguing that nothing changes, that everything is in a state of permanence. Say, how can this old man be living in the midst of changes and still claim that nothing changes, that everything is permanent? It means that he does not understand anything. That as he is speaking, everything is still changing, and yet he does not realize that. Now, to defend his mentor or master, Zeno, the Eleatic, or Zeno of Ilia, came to the scene. Zeno did not present any philosophy per se, but he came with the idea that he wants to defend his master, to prove to the Pythagoreans who were criticizing Parmenides, to make them aware, to realize that truly Parmenides was right by claiming that everything is in a state of permanence, that nothing changes. Now, to prove his point, Zeno came up with very many ingenious arguments. Very many ingenious arguments. He said, in order to convince the Pythagoreans that nothing changes, he said he was going to start his argument from the theories already given or taught by the Pythagoreans. One of such theories is that according to the Pythagoreans, they said according to the Pythagoreans, they had taught the world that that the shortest distance between 2 points, one is a straight line. So the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Secondly, that every straight line is made up of indefinite number of points. Every straight line is made up of what? Indefinite number of points. Now Zeno argued and said, if we go by this theory that every straight line is made up of indefinite number of points, it means that to move from point A to point B, you will need indefinite number of points to do so. And if you need indefinite number of points, it means that for you to cover indefinite number of points, it means that you have to do so in an indefinite time. And he said, let us assume that it's a race between Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles at that time was the fastest runner in Greece, and tortoise was the slowest animal. He said, if there is a race between Achilles and the tortoise, as long as you put the tortoise in front of the Achilles, just few meters away, no matter how fast Achilles runs, he can never catch up with the tortoise. Reason being that for Achilles to move from point A to meet the tortoise in point B, he has to cover indefinite number of points. And he can only cover indefinite number of points in an indefinite time. So if you multiply indefinite by indefinite, it gives you 0. If you multiply indefinite points by indefinite time, it amounts to 0, meaning that nothing changes, meaning that there was no motion. And if there was no motion, then nothing had changed. Everything is in a state of permanence. Everything remained the same. So that was the first argument of Zeno. The second argument of Zeno is that he reminded the Pythagoreans that you have taught us that every object occupies a space equal to its size. In other words, every object, that is at rest, every object at rest occupies a space equal to its size, according to the Pythagoreans. He said, now, it means, if we go by that argument, it means that a flying arrow at the height of its flight is motionless. He said, let us take the fact that you have an arrow. The moment you shoot the arrow and it's at the height of its flight, what does it do? At that point, even though it seems to be in motion, it is seen to be motionless because for it to move from point A to point B, it will always occupy a space that is equal to its size. Therefore, implying that it is motionless, it is at rest. If it's at rest, it means that it is motionless. So a flying arrow at the height of its flight is motionless because it must occupy a space equal to its size, implying that there is no motion. So Zeno of Elea was able to prove to the Pythagoreans that indeed Parmenides was right by making use of this ingenious argument to defend his master. And of course, the Pythagoreans were speechless because he based his argument on the theories they had earlier presented to them. And so that was the Eleatic school. Then the next school in the history of philosophy at this time were the pluralists. The pluralists were made up of Empedocles and Anaxagoras. Now, the pluralists were still searching for what we refer to as the basic stuff of reality, as started by Thales of Miletus and co. But they were of the view that the basic stuff of reality were simply plural. Plural in the sense that there are so many elements that makes up what we call reality, or that lays the foundation for reality. And these elements are moisture or water, air, then they mention earth and fire. There were about 4 of them, so they were multiple. And that's why we refer to them as pluralists. The foundations of reality were plural in form according to them, so they accepted the plurality of elements as the foundation of reality. Then after the pluralists, we have another group of philosophers we refer to as the atomists. Now the atomists, made up of Democritus and Leucippus. Leucippus was the founder of the school, but Democritus made it very popular. Now Leucippus and Democritus were atomists. They were still searching for the basic stuff of reality, but at this time they felt that the basic stuff of reality was the atom. In fact, they were the first to present a kind of mechanistic theory of the universe. They were the first not to look in the direction of ordinary things, but in the direction of the atom. So they created the first atomic theory. Democritus and Leucippus say that the atom is the simplest indivisible particle of all elements, and the atom was the basic stuff of reality. That everything is only divisible to the level of the atom as at that time. And so the basic stuff of reality for which the world is looking for is only found in the atom, since the atom was the smallest indivisible particle of our element, and that these atoms move about in the void, colliding with one another, and as they collide they disintegrate to form newer atoms. And so that is how life continues to propagate from one level to another. And then the atomists were later succeeded by the last school of ancient philosophy. And this last school of ancient philosophy were referred to as the sophists. Now the sophists turned the attention of philosophy from the cosmos to man. The cosmos, that is the universe, to man. They felt that human nature is much more complex and needed to be studied much more than the universe. Human nature is more complex than the entire universe put together, and so attention should be drawn to man, not to the universe. And the sophists began to ascertain the source of human knowledge. They questioned what we refer to as human knowledge, and they argue that it is not possible for human beings to have objective knowledge, because people claim that they have objective knowledge. They say objective knowledge is not possible. Rather, knowledge is subjective. Subjective knowledge, or what do you call it? A relative knowledge. Relative or subjective knowledge is the only possibility. Man does not have the capacity to acquire objective knowledge. Because by objective knowledge, they were talking about knowledge that is indubitable, knowledge that cannot be questioned by any means. Indubitable knowledge is objective knowledge. Whereas they claim that man's capacity can only help you to acquire relative or subjective knowledge. Relative knowledge is everybody holding on to his or her own opinion. What you know is known to you, and what I know is known to me. what I know might be different from what you know, and what you know might be different from what I know. So human differences entail that human beings have different kinds of knowledge at different levels. So that was what they believed, but they said possibility of objective knowledge was not there. And so while they accepted the idea of relative or subjective knowledge, they rejected the idea of objective knowledge. And these sophists or skeptics were many in numbers at that time. We have people like Protagoras, who was one of the oldest sophists. Protagoras. We have Gorgias. We have Zeno. Sorry, not Zeno. We have what's his name now? We have Protagoras, Gorgias, Thrasymachus. Yes, Thrasymachus. And which other name? Well, I think there were several names among them. And these people were known for some famous statements they made. For instance, Protagoras said that man is the measure of all things, of things that are that they are, and of things that are not that they are not. This statement implies that man, the human mind, is in fact the standard for all forms of knowledge. And since human mind is different from one another, there is no way we can talk about objective knowledge. Rather, we can talk about subjective or relative knowledge. Because the human mind was the standard for the measurement of human knowledge. Then Gorgias said that even if we have knowledge, that it is not possible to have objective knowledge. But even if we have objective knowledge, it wasn't possible to communicate it. And Thrasymachus was known to have stated that, that might is right. Justice was simply the interest of the strong, and that might is right. And then we have one other, I'm trying to remember the name now, just keep my memory. One other popular sophist or skeptic who said that honey is sweet, I refuse to assert. That honey is sweet, I refuse to assert. It appears sweet, I fully grant. That honey is sweet, I refuse to assert. It appears sweet, I fully grant. Implying that you can only talk about relative knowledge and not objective knowledge. Because the taste of honey, according to him, he saw that one can only explain how it appears, to his taste buds, and not how actually it is. Because it is possible for one, for instance, who suffers from a particular ailment, not to be able to tell exactly the taste of honey, or that honey might taste differently in his own mouth than it tastes in other people's mouth, implying that knowledge is simply relative. So relative or subjective knowledge was just one common denominator among all the sophists or the skeptics. Now, these different schools of philosophy were also referred to as the pre-Socratics, that is, people before Socrates. The second stage in the history of ancient philosophy began with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So, if some people want to confuse you, they might tell you that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were the first philosophers in recorded history. They were not. One thing about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle is that they made philosophy very popular and lucrative during their time. And so people began to patronize philosophy because of the influence of these three men, not necessarily because they founded it. So Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle represented the golden age of Greek philosophy. Maybe in my next class we may have to continue with that. For now, let me pause and give you the opportunity to reflect on all that I have said while we continue with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in our next class to round up the brief history of philosophy. Thank you.